Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Rotary meeting for Monday, February 14th. I will now call upon John Eberhard to introduce our guest speaker.
And what a pleasure it is to be able to introduce this London historian. We will hear today about the most important and exciting years of London's history. Our speaker is well qualified to do that. Jennifer Grainger has a Master of Library and Information Sciences from Western University and a Master of Arts and Archaeology from the University of London, UK that is. She's past president of both the London and Middlesex Historical Societies and London branch of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. She's authored a number of books, one of them being The Vanished Villages of Middlesex, another, The Vanished Villages of Elgin, and a book entitled Early London, 1826-1914. She has also edited Honoring Our Roots, featuring Delaware and Westminster Townships, and her most recent works are the London Free Press photo histories entitled From the Vault, Volumes 1 and 2. Today, she'll talk about Volume 2, which is the period from 1950 to 1975. I've read it. It's most interesting. Familiar places, events, people. For Londoners, a true treasure of stories published in the London Free Press in that 25-year time span. We're looking forward to hearing from you, Jennifer. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so what I thought that I would do is tell everybody a little bit about the background of the book, how it came to be, and the making of From the Vault. And then I'm going to share a few photographs with the group, not the whole book, or we'd be here all day, but just a selection going in chronological order from the early 50s into the 1970s. And at the end, I'll show you a few pictures that didn't make it into the book because they were not politically correct enough. So you can all decide whether you think they should have been included or whether my editor was correct in thinking that they should not be included. So first of all, my publisher is Biblioasis in Windsor, Ontario, and it was founded by Dan Wells. First of all, as a bookstore, a used bookstore, and then Dan decided that he needed a bigger challenge, I guess, so he decided that he would start publishing. And one of his publishing projects was to take photos from the Windsor Star and compile them into a book called From the Vault, a photo history of Windsor to 1950. That was really well received, so then he decided to do a sequel, which would take the photos from 1950 to 1975. Then his next idea was that this could be spread out across Ontario, and he could take a look at other Ontario cities and use their newspaper photos to compile histories of those cities. So looking at London, this was a great opportunity because this was around the time that the London Free Press was closing their big facility on York Street and moving into the smaller quarters that they have now on Dundas. And at their new location, they were not going to have room to store their significant photo archives. So their negatives, their huge collection of negatives, 1.6 million, in fact, were donated to Western Archives at Western University. So Dan contacted the London Free Press and Western Archives and worked out an arrangement to create a book about London history going up to 1950 using those photo negatives. Then all he needed was an author. So he just happened to be coming into Attic Books, and that's how we met. So he hired me to write the book. So we have done Early London and the two From the Vault books together now. And the way this gets done is basically one goes into Western archives and one looks at negatives that they get out, and one looks at a little light table, puts the negatives on a light table, and chooses the photographs that way. And then once those are all chosen, it's necessary to look them all up in the newspaper and find out more about what they were actually doing in the pictures. So that means that anything from the Free Press that was chosen, I had to go to the London room and actually look everything up on microfilm. Now, for volume 1, we had a challenge, which was that it turns out that the photo collection starts in about 1938. And the reason for that is because there were photos in the London Free Press before that time, but they came from various London city photographers, and the photographers simply kept their own negatives. Around 1938, the newspaper decided that they should actually hire their own photographers. And in time, they had many, many photographers on staff, somewhere probably between 20 and 30 at any given time in mid-20th century. So from 1938 onwards, they were actually keeping and storing their own photo negatives. So that's why the collection starts at that time. Of course, if you're doing a photo history of London to 1950, that means that you actually only have 12 years of photographs. So we looked around Western archives to see what else we could come up with. We also got extra photos from the London room, and there are lots of other local archives as well that you can dig into to get pictures of London's past. For example, if you want pictures of the regiment called the 1st Hussars, you can contact the 1st Hussars Museum and you can get photographs from them. So we did manage to create a very nice photo history going up to 1950. Now for From the Vault 2, it was quite different because we were able to use all photographs from the London Free Press collection. So for From the Vault 2, absolutely every photo in the book actually comes from the London Free Press negative archives at Western Archives. And I got to look up every single photo that I chose at the London room, which was, well over 1,000 photos. This took me quite some time. It took me a couple of years. So the project took significantly longer than what we were expecting it to be. And this is one of the reasons why, because I was kind of running out of time to make the deadline, the publisher pulled in a few extra local writers to do chapter introductions. And so folks like Randy Richmond and Bill Brady and James Rainey, who are all names that you'll recognize as Free Press reporters and writers, they wrote some chapter introductions as well as some other local historians. But I got to write all the captions, and it wound up taking a little bit longer than what I expected. But anyway, it definitely was a lot of fun, and we have produced what I call the baby boomer edition, which is full of pictures from mid-20th century that people who grew up in London will probably have memories of, schools that they went to, or places that they shopped, places that they worked, and lots of events that they will probably remember. The front cover of the book, I should mention that the gentleman who's on the front cover is named Bill Smith. He was actually head of the photo department in the 1960s. About 1964, the photograph was taken. So he was the guy who was in charge of all of the different photographers who took the pictures in the book and sent people out onto their assignments. This is the list that I came up with for how to divide everything that happened in London during those years. What I did to start with was I went through all the books about local history that have been produced and came up with various events that I would want to look for. And I should mention that the negatives have indexes. some of which are online and some of which are not yet online. And what has been done is they are also indexed, but you actually have to go in and look at them at Western Archives. So I was able to use these indexes to look for negatives that sounded like they would correspond with events in London history. And these are the chapters that everything was organized into. I should point out that the basic theme of the time period is expansion and growth. The population of the city in 1950 was only 94,000, but by 1975 it was 243,000. And that includes the annexations that took place over the years, not just natural growth. In 1961, there was a huge patch of land that was taken from both London and Westminster Townships, and then the city increased by 60,000 people overnight. Well, as you can imagine, new suburbs mean more schools, more churches, more shopping malls, and more traffic. So there are chapters there on our building boom, on suburbia, and a few other themes were rock and roll, which was new at that time period, Storybook Gardens, which opened at that time, Canada's Centennial in 1967, and a couple of miscellaneous catch-all chapters for the 50s and 60s, which is where we put everything that didn't really belong anywhere else. So some of the pictures starting in the early 50s and going onwards. These are new homes that were being built in Hillcrest subdivision, which is near Huron and Highbury. And the photograph was taken in September 1953. Each one of these houses, of course, had a garage because the car was now of utmost importance. And the developer, Mardlin, advertised the beauty of suburban living with all the advantages of a modern city home. I'm not sure whether anybody now would think of Huron and Highbury as the suburbs, but at that time, that was the edge of the city. So this was the kind of new development that you would have seen then. Also in 1953, this parade. Does anybody know what event is being celebrated? Well, it was the Queen's coronation. That was in 1953. And what we have here is a parade marching along Dundas Street. There were 2,000 people in the parade, and there would have been 10,000 people or so watching from the sidewalks. And at this particular point, they are going in front of Hotel London, which was on the southeast corner of Dundas and Wellington. And you notice that the negatives were usually numbered, but of course we could just easily cut that out when putting the book together. So apparently, teenage girls in the 1950s were wearing dog collars on their ankles. And the Free Press picked up on fun fashions like this. Apparently, if you wore a collar on your right ankle, that meant you were interested in one specific boy, but if you were wearing it on the left, that meant you were interested in more than one boy. So these are the kinds of things you had to think about if you were a teenage girl in 1953. And here we have a new restaurant called the Whistle Stop, which opened in 1953 on Wortley Road, just off of Stanley Street. Basically, it was a lunch counter, which was very popular at that time. And there were several pictures of the inside of the restaurant in the paper with an interview with the owner. And there were also some details about what you could find to eat if you went into the Whistle Stop. And this was quite common. Whenever a new restaurant or a new business opened, the Free Press would send out a reporter and they would do a nice feature on it. So this was great for the owner of the business. They would obviously get some advertising this way for free. Here we are building the 401 south of London in 1957, just finishing off the portion between London and Woodstock. For my own part, I find it kind of bizarre. It was something which, for me, has always been there, but it wasn't, of course, and here it is being built. So it's just a bit surreal. Storybook Gardens opened on June 25th, 1958. Now, the actual day of its opening, it rained, so there were not as many people that day as might be expected or hoped for. But on June 29th, which is when this photograph was taken, apparently 10,000 people went through, and they were mainly grown-ups, not kids. So people were really looking forward to seeing the new amusement park. However, that's probably not the thing that's most memorable about the opening of Storybook Gardens. It was, of course, a petting zoo. There were lots of animals, and one of them was Slippery the sea lion. And Slippery actually made his escape into the Thames just before the park was supposed to open. And there was a media circus as people who live near the river were searching for him. He was eventually found in a boathouse near Sandusky, Ohio. And he was taken to the nearby Toledo Zoo. And then there was a huge fuss when it was announced that the Toledo Zoo was thinking of keeping him. And how dare they keep our sea lion? So people signed petitions to send to the zoo to get Slippery back. And he was, of course, returned to us eventually. And that was the occasion for a parade. So this is downtown London on Dundas, looking west. The cross street is Richmond. And this is the parade for the occasion of the return of Slippery the seal. There were 50,000 people on the streets that day to see Slippery. And when you consider that the population of London at the time was only 100,000, this was obviously a very big event. So kind of a crazy thing. It has been suggested that this was probably just a huge prank to try and get some attention for the brand new amusement park. It was all PR, and the Toledo Zoo probably had no intention whatsoever of keeping Slippery. Be that as it may, it was obviously a big day in London. For the industry and business chapters, we have scenes like this. This is workers filling the beer kegs at Labatt's in September of 1958. Lots of new shopping plazas being built for the suburbs. Byron, of course, was a village, not built as a suburb of London, but it was annexed by the city in 1961. There's this new Byron shopping center that was built on Commissioners just west of the main intersection. It opened in June of 1955. That, of course, is still there. Another sign of the times, these workmen are at Western Fair in 1960, building a basement fallout shelter. And this was paid for by the Free Press itself. And the whole building process was put in the paper. It was built according to approved government plans, and it would provide accommodation for 5 people, just in case there was a nuclear war. You would have this fallout shelter in your basement. And this did indeed get dismantled and rebuilt into a London home after the fair was over. These ladies were London's first female police constables. June Mom on the left and Carol Ford on the right. They joined the force in 1962, and they spent much of their time actually visiting newsstands looking for obscene content and giving traffic lectures to students. That's mainly what they got the ladies to do. Well, June passed away in 1965, and Carol left the force 1 year later. And it was not for another 10 years that there would be another female officer on the force. Here is a chaotic scene. And this is the aftermath of the Rolling Stones concert in '65. April 26, 1965, the Rolling Stones came to London, Ontario, and they performed at Treasure Island Gardens. The fans got a bit rowdy, of course, being mainly teenagers, and the security that night didn't really know what to do. They were concerned about this. They'd never seen anything like it before. So their idea was that they needed to stop this. So they pulled the power cord on the amps, and then the fans rioted. So this is what it looked like afterwards: a pile of chairs. And in other pictures, there are fans being carried out by officers because they had got too rowdy. Not surprisingly, the Rolling Stones never came back. Another typical 1960s scene, there were lots of demonstrations. This one was against the war in Vietnam, and it took place on April 3rd, 1965. This is just 1 month after the war began. And these protesters are at the corner of Dundas and Richmond. I tried to cover the increasing diversity of London's population. So that includes a picture of the new mosque on Oxford Street, which was opened in 1966. And there it is. 1967 was Canada's centennial year. And throughout the year, the Free Press had lots and lots of pictures of activities that were going on to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Canada. And there were lots of local events, including the opening of Centennial Hall, which was a 1967 project. But this is the kind of thing that was typical. These ladies worked at Ontario Loan and Debenture, and they all dressed in historical costumes on June 29th of that year. And they joined the lady around the organ and sang historical favorites to customers as they came in to do their business. So lots of fun things like that were going on throughout the year, and the Free Press covered them. Another sign of the times, a beauty pageant. There were lots and lots of them. I was actually amazed at how many beauty queens were in the paper. This is Gail Evans, who was 22 years old and a nurse at Victoria Hospital. And she became Miss London and District at Centennial Hall on November 2nd, 1968. She went on to the Miss Canada pageant in Toronto, but unfortunately she did not become Miss Canada. This is a scene at the old London Public Library on Queen's Avenue. It is 1969, and a television had been set up in the lobby so that folks could watch the moon landing, Apollo 11. Either they didn't have a TV or they wanted to look at this historic moment with a group of others. So chairs were set up in front of a TV so everybody could watch it. And the bearded gentleman in the front row, some of you may recognize, he's Roy MacDonald, who was a local poet and activist. He just passed away a few years ago. Roy showed up in a lot of pictures around that time. This is him as well. This is a smoke-in at Western University, or University of Western Ontario as it was at the time. The demonstration was in favor of the legalization of pot, and that is Roy MacDonald at the Bullhorn on October 31st of '69. Another demonstration of a different kind, Norman Freed of the Communist Party of Canada spoke at the library on April 16th, 1970, and there were numerous protesters in attendance. They were Ukrainian, Latvian, Estonian, some of them White Russians. The sign there says that Lenin built the Soviet prison of nations, Lenin, the greatest terrorist of all time, and Canadian communists stop and think, and so on. And again, that's the library on Queens Avenue. August 1st, 1970, a man named Eldon Forty went into Hotel London and got a room and fired 39 bullets from an upstairs window. Here's the police leading him away. London was very lucky that day because only one person was shot, a 13-year-old boy. He was shot in the leg, but nobody was killed, fortunately. As far as I know, that is London's only attempt at a mass shooting. So we have been very fortunate in that respect. Eldon Forty received 8 years in prison. Almost looks a bit like today, only a little worse. This is the storm of 71. And this is a scene on Oxford Street West, not far from Oak Ridge High School. It was one of the worst winter storms in 25 years, and it stopped traffic throughout the region. So as you can see, people just abandoned their cars on Oxford because there was no way of moving them. Another event of 1971 was the construction of the new City Hall, the one that we still have today on Dufferin. There's the skeleton going up. The Free Press was also very good at covering any celebrity who came to town, whether it was for a concert or whether it was some other cultural event. Now, you may recognize this lady as a very young Margaret Atwood. And here she is chatting with library staff before she gave a reading on October 10th, 1972. And here is a party, last call at Hotel London. Its bars closed for the last time at 1 a.m. on Sunday, March 5th, 1972. The owner, Joe McManus, had decided to close it and demolish it, but he threw a last party for staff and former staff and their guests. And so these are the revelers in the West Lounge that night. The partiers did try to use up all of the rest of the hotel's beer and liquor and were probably fairly successful. The demolition began in May. A truly shocking and horrible event. This is the day that Mayor Jane Bigelow greeted the Queen in 1973 without wearing a hat. And some of you who have lived in London for many years may remember the kerfuffle about that. But despite that breach in protocol, as people saw it, the visit actually went very well. There was a formal luncheon at Centennial Hall for the Queen and Prince Philip, and then they crossed the street and they greeted Londoners in Victoria Park. So that's where the Queen and the Mayor are in this photograph. So I'm going to show a few photos that would not make it into the newspaper today, and there are very good reasons for that. They didn't make it into the book either. Like this one, for example. It's meant to be humor, but a lot of people today would probably not find it very funny. I was simply interested in showing the fashions of the time. I'm not really sure whether the city worker can really see up her skirt or not, but what was considered funny in the late 60s is not necessarily very funny today. So that's the kind of thing you would no longer see in the newspaper. And you certainly wouldn't see this either. These are the Strathroy minstrels. They were entertaining patients at Westminster Veterans Hospital in 1953. Now, my idea about history is that it's not necessary to whitewash it or make everything look like the good old days, that we should actually present the way it really was. But people at Biblioasis do not want to offend anybody. And so things that I might have included simply did not make the final cut. So anyway, and there's one more photograph, which is very disturbing. What happened was that a little girl named Susan Cadgio was kidnapped in January of 1956. She was assaulted, and the kidnapper left her near the railway tracks near William Street, where she died just a few hours before they found her. So it's a very disturbing occasion. And believe it or not, this was actually on the front page of the newspaper on January 7th of 1956, when the little girl's body was found. My editor decided that we would not use this out of consideration for the victim and her family, which is totally understandable. But just so you know how times have changed, this was right on the front page of the paper. A very disturbing photo, but there it was. And nobody was ever caught. Nobody was arrested. So it's still an open case all these years later. Anyway, I'm going to end on a humorous note, something a little bit more cheerful. And there it is, student horse. As recently as 1957, Silverwoods was delivering milk door to door using a horse. And the horse's name here is Dolly. And to me, she looks like she's saying, "Why me?" It doesn't look like a good day for Dolly. But you can see the sign on the back of the wagon, "Caution, student horse." So that is my presentation. And you can let me know if you have any questions.
We will open it up for questions now. Go ahead, Ian.
Yes, thanks very much, Jenny, for that presentation. I just was curious if you have covered the slave chapel in your books, and if you have any update on what may be happening as far as moving it to Pioneer Village.
Yeah, it wasn't really covered in the books. What was covered was the Methodist Church, which is right next door to where it's sitting at the moment. Members of the congregation and events taking place there. But no, there was not very much about the slave chapel. And I don't have any rumors about that either, unfortunately. The last I heard, there's, yes, definitely discussion about moving it to Pioneer Village, but I don't know where they are with that, unfortunately.
Jim Swan.
You mentioned the number of negatives that were available to you and sorting through them. Where only those negatives that were published preserved, or did all of the negatives of all of the photographs that were taken by those photographers at the Free Press archived?
Yeah, they actually have all of them, even ones that were not published. So a photographer would go out and do a story and might possibly take 30 photographs, and there might be only one or two in the newspaper. And so that sometimes made it a bit challenging, because I would choose a very good photo, but if it's not one that made it into the paper, then I wouldn't be able to identify the persons who were in the picture. So I would wind up having to say something generic, like this is just revelers at a certain festival, or members of this particular congregation. But other times I would be more fortunate. There would only be a few photos taken of an event, and quite often there'd be pictures in the paper so that I could actually name the names of the people who are in the event. But yeah, definitely far more photos in the archives than ever made it into the paper. And there's a few things that I chose that it doesn't look as though they ever got into the paper at all. I would search for a couple of months and there was nothing. So it looks like the reporter or photographer was sent to an event and they decided it wasn't very important, or it wasn't important enough to warrant a picture, or there was just something really important that day that they had to cover, so they couldn't do that after all. And I never did find it. For example, there was a cute picture of farmers, potato farmers, and they were all having a dinner together. It was the Middlesex Potato Club, and everybody's sitting there dining. And of course, they've all got a potato in front of them, as well as, you know, whatever else they were having for dinner. I never did find that in the paper, unfortunately. So later I was contacted by a lady at the Strathroy Caradoc Museum. She wanted more information about the Middlesex Potato Club, and I wasn't able to tell her anything because I never did find anything in the Free Press, unfortunately. But we know that the club existed anyway.
Have you had any feedback from people since the publication who have recognized themselves in some of those photographs?
Yeah, I have a few times. I heard from a gentleman who was thrilled to discover that his sister, who's a school teacher, was in the book teaching her class. We had a photo of her in the book, and she had passed away a few years earlier from cancer. So he was just delighted to find his sister in the book. So yeah, there's a few things like that have happened. People are really pleased to find themselves in a book.
My question is will there be a third volume?
There might be a third volume. We're waiting to find out whether or not it's going to be possible to do research once the pandemic is over, gets out of the way. Because, you know, the past couple of years, it hasn't been possible to get into Western or to get into the public library to do the work. So unfortunately, because of that, we haven't been able to sell quite as many copies from the Vault 2 either. We were not able to hold a book launch. And of course, for some time, bookstores had to be closed. So that's been a bit of a challenge. But considering the times, it's done fairly well. But we're going to hope that things get a little bit back to normal before we start working on another project. I should mention that the books are available in area bookstores, including the one I work in, which is Attic Books. I'm a bit biased, obviously. I think everybody should come into Attic and buy it there, but I can sign it for you if you do come in.
Howard, you have a question.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Jenny. It was a very interesting presentation, especially for someone who's not from London. Nice to learn all about the city. My question is perhaps a little unusual. I was wondering if Doug Ball got his start at the London Free Press, and he took some famous pictures of Trudeau the Elder. So I was just wondering, and he was from London. I was just wondering if that's where he started. Or if he came across him.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't recall the name. That doesn't mean that he wasn't at the Free Press, though, because they had a very large number of photographers. In the paper's heyday in the 50s and 60s, they might have had 20 to 30 photographers. They weren't just covering London, they were covering a lot of southwestern Ontario. And it was a very thick newspaper at one time. So lots and lots of photographers. The only person who I remember is Jean Graham, because she was, for many years, the only female photographer on staff. And she went around and photographed a lot of events that I guess they considered to be feminine. But for the most part, I don't remember the individual names of the photographers, just because there's so many of them.
Harry, you have a question?
Yeah, I was twigged by the idea of that third volume. So you must have had to negotiate a lot of permissions, because I imagine between the photographers and the Free Press and whoever owns the rights to those photos. And then just a follow-up question for a potential third volume: when did the Free switch from film to digital, or did they ever?
Probably the early 90s, because their collection goes up to, I'm just checking my notes here, I think it's 92. What they have there is approximately 1936 to 1992. So I think that they were probably a bit ahead of the general population, somewhere around that time period. If we did a third volume, it would probably go up to about 2000. So at some point in the 90s, I think. film would have stopped.
And Ian, you have a question.
Yes, I have another question. Just wondering, Jerry, who's one of our members, Jerry Pribble, current owner of Marienbad and Chaucer's, do you have any archival photos showing the Free Press usage of that location, or did you find any?
We do in the first book have a photograph of that building from when they owned it, when they were in that building. Yes.
Okay, well, great. And the other question I had was, since so many famous rock bands and other performers came through London in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, how many, I would say, great photos did you find, and was it difficult to choose what to include in the book?
Lots and lots of photos of people who came to town. Simon and Garfunkel were invited by Western Student Union. There's photos of Ian and Sylvia. There was a big rock concert in the 50s in which there was multiple people who were popular at that time. Lots and lots. And what usually happens is that there will be a photographer who is sent to cover the event, and there may be like a film roll of pictures that they took, and yeah, it's simply a question of trying to find the photograph that's likely to be the most meaningful to people today. So for example, for the Rolling Stones, I got a good picture of Mick and the boys hamming it up in front of the camera. And then there's also a couple of pictures of rowdy fans, and then the aftermath with all the chairs thrown around the room. So it's not too difficult. If you've looked at lots of photo histories, you have an idea of what makes a good photograph. People who are looking at the camera, a photograph in which it's likely that you'll be able to get all the names, or just something that really stands out that people will be very surprised to see.
One of the concerts that I remember well at Western was Harry Chapin, and it wasn't long after that concert that he had the heart attack and died while he was driving. So it was one of the last concerts that he gave that actually happened at Western. And also I remember, in my first couple of years at Western, people like Chuck Berry, Chicago, Sam and Dave, Beach Boys, I think. There was lots of great acts that came through at that time.
James Rainey said to me that I should have included Oscar Peterson in the book, and that I shouldn't have missed that because he came to London on more than one occasion. And he's right, I did miss that, and that should probably have been included. And that's probably just because I'm more of a pop fan than a jazz fan, so I didn't pick up on that. But Oscar Peterson was quite often in London.
There was Duke Ellington also, who played with the orchestra at Centennial Hall. Did you find any photos of that?
I didn't, but I wouldn't be surprised if they would have featured that.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And I'm going to cut off the question and answer now. If you can stick around, Jenny, it sounds like there might be some more questions for you, but we do have to finish off our meeting here. We would like to thank you for your presentation today. For those of us, which is a lot of us present, that have been in London for a big chunk of our life. Very, very, very interesting. In recognition of your presentation to the club today, a contribution has been made to the Polio Plus campaign of the Rotary Foundation to immunize 50 infants against polio. Because of you, Rotary is now one step closer to a polio-free world. So thank you very much. And if you can stick around, we'll continue some question and answer at 1 o'clock, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A few announcements. Steve Knox, you wanted to talk about this?
Yes, I'm unmuted. I just want to remind everybody that there are three, they used to call them Rotary Leadership Institute programs. And it's geared towards new Rotarians primarily, but it gives a really in-depth and broad view of what Rotary is and how it came to be and where we're going. So I really encourage any new member that has not, even older members that have not attended the Rotary Now Learning Information Leadership Institute. They've retitled it, just to say it's really not just for leaders, it's really for every Rotarian, but it's in 3 parts. It's a very, very enjoyable program. It's $20, so it's not heavy duty expense, but I do encourage everybody to try. It is sequential. So you take Rotary 1, Part 2, Part 3 in sequence. So they're having now in March 14th and March 21st, they have the Part 2 series available. So anybody who's taken Part 1 could join this one. There are also other leadership institutes that are presented by other districts. And because they're Zoom now, you may be able to sign up in a different district if you wanted to take session 1 and then follow up with session 2 right away. So I do encourage you, if you need more information, give me a holler. Thanks, Don.
Next announcement is Diane.
Hi, everybody. I just have a couple of announcements. First of all, I did send out an email to every member because the Canadian Blood Services have issued a call to action to all donors, new and returning, to help replenish the national blood inventory and prevent a significant drop in the supply of blood products. Because of COVID and isolation requirements coupled with the winter storms we've been having, this has affected donor attendance and the availability of employees. So they're asking employees and volunteers who are eligible to donate to consider booking an appointment within the next week or 2. And I know there's about 4 or so great folks from our club who have already made an appointment in the next week or so. So thank you for that. But if you are eligible, or if you could pass this information on to your family and friends, we should, it'd be great to help bring that supply up. And also, Don, I'm hoping we can maybe send that email out to all the London clubs, because that way, we can work together as a London Rotary team and help replenish the donations. And then my other announcement is just we have a food bank opportunity this Wednesday, 6:30 to 8, and I've got 8 members, and we can still have 4 more. So if you're interested, let me know. And also, it's a great idea for high school students' volunteer hours. So if you have grandchildren or children in that age group, they're very welcome too. That's it.
Thank you. I won't talk too much about the Rotary Some Kind of Party. We're having a committee meeting tomorrow. We will probably talk about it a little bit more next week, but mark that off in your calendar. The Some Kind of Party will be on May 6th of this year. And I think the other announcement I have, we talked about it briefly last week. I'll make sure this goes into the COG this week, so people are aware of some district service opportunities, different ways you can help out at the district level in different programs. We do not have a meeting next week. It is Family Day, so we will not be meeting. The Satellite Club will be meeting tomorrow night, and Heather Langford, their latest member, newest member, will be doing her About Me talk. Heather's quite interesting. She was an exchange student from District 6330 to Mexico many years ago, and then lived in Korea, I think, for 5 years. So she'll have a few interesting stories. We also have our board meeting this Wednesday night at 5 p.m. The Zoom link for that is in the ECOG. And as always, we have our cocktail hour tomorrow night, Tuesday at 5, and the coffee clutch Thursday at 10:30. And that is it for our meeting this week. Thank you very much, everyone. And a reminder that we serve to change lives.